The rain wasn't just falling, it was hammering the city, a relentless, drowning static that muffled everything but the sharp, deliberate slam of a car door 3 stories down. I was already at the window. I'd been standing there for 20 minutes, watching the slick black asphalt, waiting. My phone lit up on the sill, a single, stark vibration against the wood. One message. I'm downstairs. The reaction was instant. A dry ache in the back of my throat. A pulse hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. I didn't even reach for the phone. Then, the buzzer tore through the apartment's silence. From up here, the street looked like a film noir set piece, slick and distorted by the downpour. The yellow cab pulled away, tires hissing on the wet pavement, its taillights bleeding red streaks into the dark. It left her stranded there, a solitary figure isolated in the cone of sulphurous light from the street lamp. She didn't run for cover. She didn't check her phone. She just stood there, looking up at my window, indifferent to the water soaking into the shoulders of her trench coat. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, the condensation cooling my skin. I had been waiting for this specific collision of circumstances for months, maybe years. In the daylight, under the fluorescent hum of the office, we were perfectly calibrated machines. We spoke in strategy, in projections, in the clipped, efficient shorthand of 2 women at the top of their respective games. We kept the mahogany desk between us like a demilitarized zone, a necessary barrier to keep the voltage from arcing. But I knew, and she knew. It was in the way her gaze lingered a fraction of a second too long when I handed her a file, a silent communication that terrified and thrilled me. It was in the accidental brush of arms in a crowded elevator that left my skin burning for hours afterward. The apartment behind me was stiflingly quiet. The contrast was jarring. Outside, the chaotic fury of a 3 a.m. storm battering the brickwork. Inside, the thick, heavy stillness of held breath. The air felt pressurized, dense with anticipation, waiting for a spark to ignite the oxygen. I turned away from the window, the movement feeling slow, underwater. My bare feet made no sound on the hardwood as I walked toward the intercom by the door. The hallway felt miles long, stretched by the gravity of the moment. Every step was heavy with the knowledge that once I pressed that button, the carefully constructed architecture of our professional lives would begin to crumble. I stopped at the panel on the wall. My hand hovered over the talk button. It wasn't the cold making my fingers tremble. It was the adrenaline, the sheer, terrifying reality that the hypothetical was about to become physical. I took a breath, trying to steady the sudden vertigo, and pressed down. Yes? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, rough, lower than usual, stripped of its polished executive sheen. It's me. The voice was distorted by the static of the old building's system, tinny and crackling, but there was no mistaking the cadence. Even through the electronic haze, it was firm, commanding. But the armor was gone. The sharp, defensive edge she wore like a second skin in the boardroom was missing. There was a fatigue there, a vulnerability that she never allowed to show between 9 and 5. This was raw. This was the voice of a woman standing in the rain at 3 a.m. because the logic of staying away had finally failed against the pull. I know, I said. There was a pause, filled only by the hiss of the rain through the speaker and the static of the open line. I could imagine her down there, water dripping from the hem of her coat, eyes fixed on the camera lens, unflinching. She wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a fact. She was here. I moved my finger to the door button. The lock released with a loud, mechanical buzz that echoed through the empty lobby downstairs. It was a sharp, decisive sound. A surrender. I held it down for a long beat, ensuring the heavy iron door had time to unlatch, ensuring there was no way for the wind to slam it back in her face. I listened for the click of the connection breaking. Then the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She was inside. The sanctuary had been breached. The elevator in this pre-war building is a relic, a slow-moving cage of iron and grease that announces its journey with a symphony of mechanical complaints. I stood in the open doorway of my apartment, listening to the heavy gears grinding 3 floors down. The sound was rhythmic, a slow, agonizing ascent that seemed to stretch time into a wire pulled taut. Clunk. Whir. Clunk. Each rotation of the cables felt like it was winding the tension in my chest tighter, ratcheting up the pressure with every foot of elevation. I found myself counting the seconds between the floors. 1, 2, 3. My breathing shallow, trying to synchronize my own erratic pulse with the steady mechanical climb of the machine bringing her to me. It wasn't just a wait. It was a suspension of reality. The final few moments before the inevitable collision. I turned to the mirror hanging in the entryway to ground myself. It was an antique thing, the glass slightly de-silvered at the edges, but it offered enough clarity for a final audit. In the daylight, this glance is a tactical assessment, checking for stray hairs, ensuring the lipstick is armor grade, verifying that the mask of professional indifference is securely in place. Tonight, I was looking for the cracks. I touched my cheek. The skin was pale, flushed slightly at the cheekbones from the adrenaline. My hair was loose, unstyled, spilling over the collar of a silk robe I'd thrown on over a tank top. I looked unguarded. I looked exactly like a woman who had been waiting. I didn't try to fix it. This situation didn't call for polish. It called for the truth. I needed her to see the raw nerves beneath the surface. The elevator groaned to a halt. The heavy metal doors shuddered, then slid open with a reluctant hiss that echoed in the quiet corridor. The visual impact was immediate, a physical blow to the solar plexus that knocked the air from my lungs. She stood in the center of the small, fluorescent-lit car, water dripping from the hem of her trench coat onto the linoleum. She looked wrecked and magnificent. The storm had stripped away the meticulous presentation I was used to. Her hair, usually a formidable shield of perfect waves, was plastered dark and heavy against her neck. Her mascara was smudged slightly at the corners, a flaw that made her eyes look darker, deeper, more cavernous. She looked smaller without the heels and the power suit, yet infinitely more dangerous. In the boardroom, her power is calculated, distributed through policy and tone. Here, soaked and shivering slightly, her intensity was concentrated, a laser focus that burned. She stepped out into the hallway, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The scent hit me before she even reached the door, a complex, heady collision of the outside world and her private signature. It was the sharp metallic tang of ozone and cold city rain, overlaid with the warmth of wet wool. But beneath that, cutting through the dampness, was the scent that had haunted my distraction for months. Deep, dry sandalwood, and the heavy sweetness of expensive jasmine. It was a sensory trigger, flooding my brain with memories of close proximity meetings and shared taxis where I had sat rigid, trying not to breathe her in. Now, that scent was filling my personal space, claiming it, rewriting the sensory map of my own home. She stopped just outside the threshold. We stood there, separated by inches of air that felt suddenly viscous, charged with kinetic energy. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was loud, vibrating with everything we hadn't said for 2 years. There were no pleasantries, no "sorry for the intrusion," no "how are you?" Those scripts belonged to the daylight. Here, in the dim amber light of the hallway, the tension was a physical weight, a coiled spring compressed to its absolute limit, trembling with the potential energy of release. Her eyes tracked over my face, unflinching, reading the acceptance in my posture. She saw the open door. She saw the lack of surprise. I stepped back, a silent invitation. The movement felt momentous, a shift in axis. She crossed the threshold, bringing the storm in with her. The sound of her wet boots on my hardwood floor was heavy, deliberate. She was inside. I reached out and pushed the heavy door shut. The latch clicked, a sharp, final sound that severed the connection to the outside world. The elevator, the neighbors, the protocols, the reasons why we shouldn't, they were all locked out. We were sealed in together, and the air in the apartment instantly grew thin. We remained in the entryway for a long moment, the only sound the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water falling from her hem onto the parquet floor. It was a small, dark pool widening around her boots, a physical manifestation of the storm she had dragged across the city to my doorstep. She didn't step further in. She waited, respecting the unspoken boundary of the foyer, waiting for the ritual that had to happen before she could truly enter the space. "Let me take that," I said. My voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the heavy air of the apartment. She nodded, a sharp, tight movement. Her hands went to the belt of her trench coat. Her fingers, usually so precise, capable of signing contracts that shifted millions without a tremor, were stiff with cold. She fumbled with the wet knot. I fought the urge to reach out and do it for her, to brush her hands away and handle the wet wool myself. Instead, I watched. I watched the way her knuckles whitened as she finally worked the fabric loose. It felt voyeuristic, witnessing this dismantling of her defenses. This coat was the shell she wore to weather the world, the barrier against the elements and the eyes of others. Removing it felt less like a guest making themselves comfortable, and more like a soldier unbuckling their plate carrier after a siege. She shrugged the heavy coat off her shoulders. It slid down her arms with a wet, heavy sound, a sloughing off of the night's violence. I took it from her, the wool sodden and cold against my own skin, smelling intensely of the city rain and that underlying maddening note of sandalwood. I hung it on the hook, where it swayed heavily, a dark ghost of the storm left by the door. When I turned back, the breath caught in my throat, a sharp snag that I couldn't disguise. Underneath the shapeless, heavy armor of the trench, she was wearing silk. It was a slip dress, something terrifyingly delicate, the color of bruised plums. It clung to her frame, damp in places where the coat had failed, mapping the contours of her body with an intimacy that felt illegal in the hallway light. In the office, she was all sharp angles and structured wool, a silhouette designed to deflect. Here, stripped of the shoulder pads and the stiff collars, she was revealed. I could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the frantic rhythm of her breathing betraying the calm mask of her face. The silk dipped low in the back, exposing the sharp vulnerability of her shoulder blades, skin pale and glistening slightly with dampness. She caught me looking. She didn't cover up. She didn't cross her arms. She just stood there, letting me see the reality of her body, the undeniable fact of her presence. The air thickened, charged with a sudden spiking heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "I need a drink," she said. It wasn't a demand. It was an admission of necessity. "Bourbon," I stated, knowing it wasn't a question. "Neat." I turned and walked toward the kitchen, needing to put distance between us, needing a task to occupy hands that were suddenly itching to reach out. She followed, her footsteps lighter now, the heavy boots gone, leaving her in stocking feet that made no sound. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the under-cabinet lights that cast a warm, golden glow across the granite counters. It was an intimate, enclosed space. I pulled 2 glasses from the cupboard, the clink of crystal sounding violently loud. I reached for the bottle, the amber liquid swirling as I poured. My hand wasn't shaking, but it felt tight, the muscles locked to ensure precision. I slid the glass across the island to her. She stepped into the pool of light, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. The rain had washed away the calculated perfection of her makeup, leaving her face clean, open. A single droplet of water trailed from the wet ends of her hair, tracking a slow, glistening path down the side of her neck, disappearing into the hollow of her throat. My eyes followed it, helpless to look away. She reached for the glass. Her hand, usually a study in stillness, had a tremor. A micro-movement, barely perceptible, but I saw it. She saw me seeing it. She took a long swallow, the alcohol burning a path down, and closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, the fatigue was still there, but the gaze was sharper, focused entirely on me. "I couldn't go home," she said, her voice rough, dropping the words into the space between us like stones. "I tried. I told the driver the address, but I couldn't go back there." "Why?" I asked, though I already knew. "Because it's quiet there," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the glass until her knuckles turned white. "And if I sat in that silence for one more hour, knowing you were across the city, I think I would have shattered." "Come sit," I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. The kitchen light was too bright, too clinical for the confession that had just been made. It exposed too much, too soon. We needed the shadows. We moved into the living room. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The city glow filtering through the rain-streaked windows was enough, painting the room in shades of charcoal and bruised blue. I sat on the far end of the velvet sofa, sinking into the cushions, and she took the space next to me. She didn't sit at the opposite end, but she didn't press against me either. She left exactly 6 inches of space between us, a demilitarized zone that felt narrower than the blade of a knife. We sat in silence for a moment, nursing the bourbon. The heat radiating from her was palpable, a physical wave that washed over the small gap separating us. I could smell the rain drying on her skin, the scent of jasmine warming up, becoming headier, more cloying in the enclosed space. "The merger is in 3 days, she said quietly, staring into her glass. It was a weak parry, a reflex. She was throwing up the familiar barricades, the work, the protocol, the endless list of reasons why we were colleagues and nothing else. "I know," I replied, watching the way her fingers tightened around the crystal tumbler. "And the ethics committee meets on Tuesday. If they knew I was here..." She trailed off, taking a sharp sip of the amber liquid. "They don't," I said. "And even if they did, what rule have we broken? You're just a colleague seeking refuge from the storm." She laughed then, a low, dry sound that lacked any humor. "Is that what this is? Refuge?" She turned to face me then, shifting her weight on the cushions. The movement was slight, but in the charged atmosphere of the room, it felt seismic. Her knee brushed against mine. It was a glancing contact, fleeting, barely there, but the sensation was electric. It sent a shockwave straight up my thigh, seizing the breath in my lungs. It wasn't just touch. It was a violation of the treaty we had silently drafted years ago. That 6 inches of space had been the only thing keeping the entire structure of our professional lives from collapsing. And now, she had bridged it. She didn't pull back. She let her knee rest against mine, the silk of her dress slipping against the denim of my jeans. The contact was a constant, burning anchor point in the dark room. "I didn't come here for refuge," she admitted, her voice dropping an octave, losing the last of its defensive edge. "I came here because I was tired of the performance. I sit across from you in those meetings, and I listen to you dismantle the competition, and I have to pretend that the only thing I admire is your strategy." I set my glass down on the coffee table, the click loud in the quiet room. "It's a good strategy." "It's a deflection," she countered, her eyes locking onto mine. "We've been engaging in a 2-year standoff. The protocol, the hierarchy, the unspoken rules of the firm. They're just walls we built because we were terrified of what was on the other side. This is the nature of this kind of attraction, the kind that simmers under fluorescent lights and hides behind professional courtesy. It's not a sudden spark. It's a slow, grinding tectonic shift. It's gravity. You can spend years building structures to resist it, reinforcing the foundation with logic and fear and career preservation. You can tell yourself that the orbit you're in is stable. But gravity is patient. It waits for a crack in the armor, a moment of weakness, A rainy night at 3 a.m. when the exhaustion of holding yourself apart finally outweighs the fear of colliding. "The walls are coming down," I whispered. The air between us thickened, coiled tight with potential energy. "They were already down," she said. "I think they came down the moment I saw you standing in that window." She looked at me then, really looked at me, with a gaze that was unflinching and terrifyingly open. It was the look of someone who had done the math, weighed the risks, and decided that the crash was worth the burn. The professional dynamic, the hierarchy, the careful dance of power was dissolving in real time, replaced by a raw, terrifying equality. There was no boss here, no senior partner, just two women in a dark room, pulled together by a force that defied all the logic of the daylight world. She finished her drink in one long swallow, the action deliberate and final. She leaned forward and placed her empty glass next to mine on the table. The sound was a punctuation mark. The preamble was over. The theoretical discussion of why she shouldn't be here was finished. She turned back to me, and the distance between us seemed to vanish entirely, though neither of us had moved. Her hands were empty now, resting on her lap, palms up. An open gesture, a surrender, or perhaps an invitation. "I'm done waiting," she said, her voice steady, stripped of all pretense. "I'm done pretending that this isn't the only thing that matters." Her movement was slow, telegraphing the intent so I had every second to retreat. I didn't. Her hand came up, hovering for a heartbeat before making contact. When her fingers finally grazed the line of my jaw, the sensation was sharp, immediate. Her skin was still cool from the storm, a startling contrast to the fever heat rising in the room. That temperature difference, the cold rain against my flushed skin, grounded the moment in a terrifying reality. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was tactile. It was happening. Her thumb traced the angle of my chin, a deliberate mapping of territory she had only ever observed from across a boardroom table. My breath hitched, a sharp, jagged intake of air that sounded deafening in the quiet apartment. It was a crack in the armor, a signal flare that the walls were not just down, they were dust. My internal monologue, usually a disciplined stream of analytical data and risk assessments, fractured into absolute static. The noise of the day evaporated, leaving only the high-frequency hum of the present moment and the sensation of her calloused fingertips, rougher than I expected, capable, sliding up toward my ear. She shifted closer, the silk of her dress rustling like dry leaves. Her eyes, dark and heavy-lidded, dropped from my gaze to my mouth. It wasn't a subtle glance. It was a claim. The weight of her attention felt physical, a pressure building behind my ribs. In the office, we played a game of evasion. Here, she held the look, stripping away the layers of professional distance until I felt exposed, raw. Then came the shift, the move from tentative exploration to something bolder. Her thumb dragged slowly across my lower lip. It was a question and a command all at once. The texture of her skin against the softness of my mouth sent a jolt straight to the base of my spine. It was a teasing touch, lingering, testing the give. She wasn't rushing. She was savoring the collapse of my resistance. I could feel the tremor in her hand had vanished, replaced by a steady, terrifying confidence. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was dismantling me, piece by piece, with a single touch. I leaned in. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a magnetic response to the pull she was exerting. Gravity. As I moved into her space, the scent envelope enveloped me completely. The smell of the rain was fading, replaced by the warmth of her skin, that complex mix of sandalwood and the salt of her own anticipation. It was intoxicating. Our breathing fell into a synchronized rhythm, heavy and audible, drowning out the distant drum of the rain against the glass. It was the sound of two systems overloading, of the careful calibration of our lives failing under the strain of proximity. Her hand slid from my jaw to the nape of my neck, her fingers tangled in the hair there, tightening slightly. It wasn't a gentle caress. It was a grip, a demand. The pressure forced me to tilt my head back, exposing the line of my throat to her gaze. It was a possessive gesture, one that said, "You are here with me, and you are not going anywhere." The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The executive who commanded rooms was gone. In her place was this woman, driven by a hunger that had been starving in the dark for too long. She pulled me forward, just an inch, but that inch was everything. The gap between us, the one we had respected for 2 years, was gone. We were breathing the same air now. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the dilation of her pupils swallowing the iris. I could feel the heat radiating from her chest, burning through the thin silk of her dress and the cotton of my shirt. The anticipation was a physical ache, a tightness in the chest that demanded release. This was the edge of the cliff. We had walked up to it together, step by agonizing step, through months of late nights and shared coffees. Now, we were standing on the precipice, toes over the edge, looking down into the free fall. She didn't speak. Language belonged to the world we had locked out. Here, in the shadows, there was only the language of the body. She tilted her head, just slightly, aligning us. The movement was slow, agonizingly deliberate. She was giving me one last chance to pull away, to reinstate the protocol. But I didn't run. I couldn't. The tether was too strong. I let my eyes flutter shut, surrendering to the dark, to the sensation of her breath ghosting across my lips, warm and laced with the faint, oaky scent of the bourbon. The wait was over. The silence we had carefully curated, the silence we had lived in, was about to break. The kiss was not tentative. It was an assertion of ownership, a sudden and violent release of months of coiled tension that had lived in the silence between us. When her mouth finally closed over mine, it wasn't a question. It was an answer. The impact was immediate, a collision that jarred the breath from my lungs and replaced it with the taste of her. She tasted of the oaky burn of the bourbon, of the cool rain that still clung to her skin, and of a sharp, terrifying desire that had been distilled down to its purest form. I had expected hesitation. I had expected a moment where we both paused to acknowledge the line we were crossing, the sheer magnitude of the mistake we might be making. But she gave me no time for analysis. She kissed me with the same formidable intensity she brought to every aspect of her life, but stripped of the cold calculation. This was raw. It was messy. It was the feeling of a dam breaking, the water rushing through with a force that could not be stopped or steered. My hands, which had been hovering in the uncertain space between us, finally found purchase, gripping the wet silk of her dress at her waist. The fabric was cool and slippery under my palms, but the heat radiating from the skin beneath it was scorching. The sensory overload was absolute. The room seemed to shrink down to the point of contact. The sound of the rain against the window faded into a distant white noise, replaced by the ragged, synchronized rhythm of our breathing and the soft, wet sounds of our mouths moving together. The friction of the silk against the denim of my jeans, the slide of her stockings against my leg, the smell of her jasmine perfume spiking with the sudden rise in body temperature. It was too much, and it wasn't enough. In the office, our dynamic is defined by a rigid verticality. She leads, I execute. She strategizes, I implement. We are structures of hierarchy and protocol. But in the darkness of my living room, that architecture dissolved into dust. There was no boss here. There was no subordinate. There was only raw, unadulterated want. The power dynamic shifted, liquid and fluid, pouring back and forth between us. She pressed me back against the cushions, her weight settling over me, claiming the space. But her hands were trembling with a vulnerability that leveled the field. It felt like a complex surgical suture, finally pulling tight. For 2 years, we had been two edges of a jagged wound, separated by the artificial, sterile strips of professionalism and fear. We had existed in proximity, but in isolation. Now, finally, we were knitting together. The connection was visceral, a healing that stung as it closed. It was the feeling of a complex algorithm finally resolving after running in an infinite loop, the variables locking into place, the error messages vanishing, leaving only the clean, undeniable truth of the solution. Her hands began to explore, moving with a desperate, starving familiarity. She wasn't just touching me. She was mapping the terrain she had been denied for so long. Her palms swept down the line of my back, her nails grazing the fabric of my shirt, sending sharp rivulets of electricity racing along my spine. She found the hem of my top and didn't hesitate, her fingers slipping underneath to make contact with bare skin. The shock of her touch against my lower back arched my spine off the sofa. Her hands were cool, confident, tracing the curve of my waist, counting the ribs, seeking out the sharpness of my hip bone. She dug her thumbs into the hollows there, a grounding pressure that anchored me to the moment even as my head spun. It was a bolder teasing now, a deliberate escalation. She pulled back just an inch, her lips swollen and wet, her eyes heavy-lidded and dark. She didn't look at my eyes. She watched her own hand as it moved up my side, her thumb grazing the underside of my breast through the fabric, a ghost of a touch that made my entire body seize with anticipation. "I've been waiting," she whispered. The words were broken, breathless, vibrated against the sensitive skin of my neck where she buried her face. "God, I have been waiting." It was repeated like a mantra, a prayer spoken against my skin. "I've been waiting." I couldn't speak. My vocabulary had been reduced to gasp and touch. I tangled my fingers in the damp hair at the nape of her neck, pulling her closer, demanding more pressure, more friction. The air in the living room was too thin, too open. We needed walls. We needed the absolute, suffocating sanctuary of the dark. The transition wasn't spoken, but it was understood. The gravity of the moment shifted, pulling us away from the couch, pulling us toward the hallway. We moved as a tangled entity, limbs heavy and coordinated by instinct, leaving the empty bourbon glasses and the wreckage of our professional boundaries behind in the shadows of the living room. The fade was gradual, the hallway swallowing us, the destination implied, but heavy with an intent that drowned out everything else. I woke to a world that had been scrubbed clean of color. The room was bathed in the flat, slate-gray light of a rainy dawn, the kind of light that doesn't so much illuminate as it does reveal. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime in the darkest hours, leaving behind a heavy, resonant stillness that pressed against the window panes. The frantic, hammering rhythm of the rain was gone, replaced by the occasional, distant hiss of tires on wet pavement 3 stories down. For a long, disorienting moment, I didn't move. I didn't open my eyes fully. I just lay there, suspended in the gray quiet, cataloging the unfamiliar geography of my own bed. It felt smaller, the space condensed. There was a weight across my waist that shouldn't have been there, heavy, solid, undeniable. It was a grounding pressure, an anchor that kept me from drifting back into the solitary routine of my usual mornings. I shifted slightly, and the sensation of entanglement became absolute. My legs were woven with hers, a complex knot of limbs under the duvet. The heat was stifling in the best way possible, a humid, shared warmth that felt like a separate ecosystem from the cool, damp air of the apartment. I breathed in, and the air didn't smell like laundry detergent or stale sleep. It smelled of her. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine had migrated from her skin and stamped itself indelibly into the cotton of my pillowcases, into the sheets, into the very air I was breathing. It was a territorial claim, invisible but absolute. I turned my head slowly on the pillow, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality of the morning. She was still asleep. In the relentless fluorescent glare of the office, I had studied her face for years. I knew the sharp arch of her brow when she was skeptical, the tightening of her jaw when she was negotiating, the impenetrable mask of calm she wore like a shield. But I had never seen this. Sleep had stripped away the boardroom armor completely. The tension that usually held her features in a state of perpetual readiness was gone, leaving behind a softness that felt almost illicit to witness. Her mouth was slightly parted, her breathing deep and rhythmic, a slow cadence that my own heart was trying to match. Her hair, usually so perfectly contained, was a chaotic dark halo against the white pillow, strands of it falling across her cheek. She looked younger. She looked human. She looked like someone who didn't carry the weight of a 9-figure merger on her shoulders. But as the gray light brightened, sharpening the edges of the furniture, the old anxieties began to creep in from the periphery. The protocol, the hierarchy, the devastating logic of the daylight world. My mind, booting up from the haze of sleep, started running the risk assessment. Was this the moment where the regret set in? In the frantic, adrenaline-fueled heat of 3 a.m., the decision to let her in had felt inevitable, like gravity. But 3 a.m. is a lawless country. 7 a.m. is when the rules come back. I watched her sleep, a knot of cold fear tightening in my stomach. I was terrified that she would wake up, look at me, and see a mistake. I was terrified that she would reach for her armor before she even reached for me. Then, the rhythm of her breathing changed. A small hitch, a sigh. She stirred, her brow furrowing slightly as consciousness began to pull her back from the dark. I held my breath, my body going rigid, bracing for the recoil. Her eyes opened. For a second, there was that universal moment of disorientation, the cloudy, unfocused look of someone trying to remember where they are and why the ceiling looks different. I saw the memory of the night flood back in, sharpening her gaze. She blinked, focusing on my face, mere inches from hers. I waited for the flinch. I waited for the apology. Instead, the corners of her mouth curled up into a slow, lazy smile. It wasn't the polite, practiced smile she gave to clients. It was soft, knowing, and devastatingly intimate. It was a smile that said, I know exactly where I am, and I have no intention of leaving. She didn't speak. She just shifted closer, closing the tiny gap between us, and buried her face in the crook of my neck. The tension in my chest, the fear of the morning light, the dread of the protocol, snapped and vanished. The frantic, desperate energy of the night before had burned off, leaving something else in its place. This wasn't the collision of two celestial bodies anymore. It was the settling of the earth after the quake. It was lazy. It was warm. It was grounded. Morning, she mumbled against my skin, her voice thick with sleep and completely devoid of regret. Morning, I whispered back, exhaling the word like a prayer. The storm was over, but the atmosphere in the room hadn't cleared. It had just changed pressure. We weren't two colleagues waking up after a mistake. We were two women waking up to a new baseline. The straight line of our professional lives had been bent into a circle, enclosing us here, in this bed, in this gray morning light. And as her arm tightened around my waist, pulling me back down into the warmth, I knew that the day could wait. The world outside could wait. The only thing that mattered was this silence, and the woman who had finally broken it. The transition from the bedroom to the kitchen is usually where the fantasy dies, where the harsh overhead lighting exposes the awkwardness of a one-night stand. But as I watched her walk across the hardwood floor, the silence wasn't empty. It was comfortable and warm. She had pulled on one of my white button-down shirts, the fabric billowing slightly around her frame. It was a classic image, almost a cliché, But seeing it in reality hit me with an undeniable physical blow. The sleeves were too long, rolled haphazardly up her forearms, and the tails brushed her mid-thigh. It didn't look like she was borrowing it. It looked like an annexation. She hadn't just put on clothes. She had wrapped herself in my scent, in my history. It was a visual claim that said more than any conversation we could have had. I leaned against the counter, watching the coffee maker hiss and gurgle, a quiet domestic rhythm that felt strangely sacred. She stood next to me, hip resting against the granite, holding the ceramic mug with both hands as if trying to absorb its warmth directly into her bones. In the boardroom, she drank espresso, short, black, functional, fuel for the machine. Here, she blew softly on the steam, her eyes half closed, savoring the ritual. I moved closer, eliminating the gap until our shoulders brushed. It wasn't the electric, high-voltage shock of last night. It was a steady, low-frequency hum, a connection that had settled. "We have the strategy sync at 9, she said, her voice low, still rough with sleep. She didn't look at me. She watched the dark liquid swirl in her cup. It was the first intrusion of the outside world, the first reminder of the clock ticking down. "I know," I replied, keeping my tone even. "Agenda item 1, the merger." "Agenda item 2, she murmured, turning her head to look at me, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Navigating the fact that I'm wearing the opposing counsel's shirt. The question hung there, heavy and unavoidable. What happens when the elevator doors open on the 30th floor? Do we revert? Do we put the masks back on and pretend that the only thing we share is a profit margin? The fear of that reversion had been the only thing keeping me awake. But looking at her now, unguarded, soft, drinking my coffee in my kitchen, I realized the protocol was already dead. You can't unknow the feel of someone's skin. You can't unhear the way they say your name in the dark. We don't hide, I said, the decision forming as I spoke it. But we don't broadcast either. She looked at me, her gaze sharp, analyzing the play. A pocket veto? Private equity, I corrected. This, us, it's not a liability. It's the asset. The realization settled between us like concrete pouring into a mold. Heavy, wet, and setting fast. The secret wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a source of power. The knowledge that while everyone else in that boardroom was operating on surface-level data, we were connected by a deep, subterranean current gave us an edge. It was a foundation poured in the middle of the night, invisible to the naked eye, but supporting the entire structure. She set the mug down on the counter with a deliberate click. I like that, she said. Private equity. She turned fully toward me, stepping into my space. Her hand slid around my waist, slipping under the back of the shirt she was wearing to rest flat against the skin of my lower back. The touch was possessive, lingering. It was a reassurance that the armor she was about to put back on was just a costume. Her thumb rubbed slow circles against my spine. I have to go, she said, though she made no move to pull away. I have to go home and change into something that scares the junior partners. You're terrifying enough as is, I said, leaning in to brush my lips against her temple. I know, she whispered, but I feel different, stronger. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, her hand pressing firmly against my back. I'm not leaving this here, you know. This isn't a one-off transaction. I know, I said. The deal is signed. Good. She took a step back, the loss of contact leaving a cold spot on my skin. Because I'm keeping the shirt. She moved back to the entryway, the transition from the intimate warmth of the kitchen to the threshold, feeling like a scene change in a complex play. She didn't take off the shirt. Instead, she reached for her trench coat, the heavy wool still damp and smelling of the storm, and slid it on over the white cotton. It was a strange hybrid armor. The outer shell was the formidable executive who controlled boardrooms and dictated mergers, but the layer beneath, the one touching her skin, belonged entirely to this apartment. She belted the coat, cinching it tight, hiding the evidence of the morning, but we both knew it was there. The transformation was visual, not structural. She looked like the woman who had arrived at 3 a.m., but the frantic, hollowed-out exhaustion was gone, replaced by a sharp, kinetic vitality. She wasn't just putting the armor back on. She was reinforcing it with something stronger than policy. I walked her to the door. The hallway, which had felt like a mile-long gauntlet of tension and vertigo just a few hours ago, now felt manageable, almost benign. The shadows that had seemed ominous in the witching hour had retreated under the steady, uncompromising glare of the morning corridor lights. We stood at the threshold where she had arrived, soaked and shivering, but the air between us was no longer vibrating with the frantic energy of the unknown. It was humming with a steady, low-frequency power. The question mark that had hung over our heads for 2 years, the endless what if, had been straightened into an exclamation point. She didn't say goodbye. Goodbye implies a separation, a severing of ties, and we both knew that was no longer physically possible. We were tethered now, connected by a complex suture of shared secrets and sensory memory. "I'll see you at 9, she said, her hand resting on the doorframe, her nails catching the fluorescent light. It was a mundane sentence, a scheduling update, but the subtext was deafening. I will see you. I will know you. I am carrying you with me. I'll be the one across the table, I replied, the corner of my mouth lifting. She stepped into the elevator. The heavy metal doors began to slide shut, cutting off the view of her standing there, half armored in her trench coat, half exposed by the dark, possessive knowledge in her eyes. The mechanism was just as loud, just as grinding as it had been on her ascent, but now it sounded like a promise being kept, rather than a threat. The gears engaged with a heavy clunk, and she was gone, descending back into the city, back into the fray. I turned back into the empty apartment. Usually, this is the moment where the loneliness rushes back in to fill the vacuum, where the silence feels oppressive and accusing. But as the lock clicked shut, the silence felt different. It was rich, textured. The air still held the charge of her presence. I walked back to the living room. The 2 bourbon glasses were still on the table, amber dregs catching the gray morning light. The cushions on the sofa still held the impression of her weight. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine was everywhere. A ghost that refused to be exorcised, hanging heavy in the curtains, in the upholstery, in my own lungs. I realized then that the straight line of my professional life, that rigid, unbending vector I had been following for a decade, had been bent. It had been twisted into a complex, beautiful knot. And looking around the room, feeling the phantom warmth of her touch on my waist, I knew I never wanted to straighten it out again. The storm brought her to the door, but it was the undeniable truth of the desire that made her stay. The wait is finally over, but the real story, the one that happens in the quiet, charged spaces between the meetings and the public glances, has just begun. If you've ever felt that magnetic pull that defies all logic and reason, hit subscribe to follow where this connection leads.